In addition to conversations about the rights of detainees in the War on Terror, there is also a lot of dialogue over the impact of the War on Terror domestically in the United States. In 2001, Congress passed the enormous USA Patriot Act. This was passed hastily in the wake of 9/11, and it gave very broad powers to law enforcement to investigate domestic terrorism. The National Security Administration, or NSA, was given authority to wiretap phones without a court warrant. And a new department was created to coordinate this investigation of potential threats at home, the Department of Homeland Security. With the Patriot Act, many 1970s era reforms that had sought to restrict federal power in the wake of the Watergate scandal and the Church Committee report and all of this abuse and overstepping of the executive branch, all of this starts to be eroded. Agencies now had authority to wiretap and spy on citizens, open letters and read email, and to get records from third parties, like universities, without your knowledge. And all without evidence that a crime had been committed. And naturally, this spooked a lot of Americans because these are not things that are considered normally allowable during peacetime. So we come back to the age-old question of how much freedom is it acceptable to give up in the name of security? And a lot of these questions over the war on terrorism's impact on civil liberties and rights in the United States end up popping up before the Supreme Court in the early 2000s. The Supreme Court hears a number of landmark cases before we get to the terrorism-specific ones. The Supreme Court had revisited affirmative action in a case over the University of Michigan's admissions policy. Remember, the Supreme Court had first heard a challenge in the Bakke versus University of California over can you allow quotas for affirmative action. And in the Bakke case in the late 70s, the Supreme Court had said that you could not have quotas, but you could consider race as one criteria of admission. So that notion that you could consider race in admission was challenged, and the Supreme Court ruled in the early 2000s, 5-4, that universities had a compelling interest to create diverse student bodies, and so they could use race as one of many factors when considering admission. The Supreme Court also gave the LGBTQ rights movement a big win when, in Lawrence v. Texas in 2003, the Supreme Court overturns a Texas law that had criminalized homosexual acts, or same-sex sex. Justice Anthony Kennedy, who was generally a conservative justice for most of his time on the court, argued that the Constitution was a living document that expands as society changes. Kennedy will write the majority ruling in Lawrence v. Texas. He will also later go on to write the majority ruling for another landmark gay rights case, Obergefell v. Hodges, in 2015, that legalizes same-sex marriage across the United States. Now, when it came to the rights of terror detainees, the Supreme Court repeatedly rejected Bush's claim that he could ignore laws and treaties in his role as the executive in the name of prosecuting war on terror. So the executive branch could not do whatever it wanted in the war on terrorism. In the case of Hamdi v. Rumsfeld in 2004, Yasser Hamdi was a U.S. citizen who had moved to Saudi Arabia and been captured in the war on terror. And he was held without charges or access to a lawyer in South Carolina. In an 8-1 ruling, the Supreme Court stated that a time of war was not an excuse to suspend civil liberties, because remember, Hamdi is a citizen of the United States. And Hamdi was eventually released in Saudi Arabia after promising to renounce his American citizenship. The Supreme Court is going to continue to guarantee rights for both citizens caught up in the war on terror, but also non-citizens. In Hamdan v. Rumsfeld in 2006, the Supreme Court ruled 5-3 that the U.S. must honor the Geneva Convention for detainees, and that included basic rights. And it could not hold military tribunals that were not authorized by Congress. And in Boumediene v. Bush in 2008, detainees could challenge being held at Guantanamo Bay in U.S. courts. So, at least in the first decade of the 2000s, the Supreme Court continues to reaffirm that the war on terrorism does not give the United States government a blank check on trampling over the rights of people caught up in it. That there is a fine balance between freedom and security, and the United States had moved to take away too many freedoms in the name of security. We're still having this conversation today. This is not something that ends with the Supreme Court case in 2008. The war on terrorism has morphed and evolved since then, and this is something that we're still dealing with almost 2 decades after September 11th. As to whether we will still be dealing with terrorism on a daily basis 10 years from now, historians don't predict the future. That's not our jam. There's a field within political science or government called future studies. You can go and check them out and ask them what they predict for the future. But definitely, the war on terrorism is complicated because you don't have a clear enemy. You don't have a clear ending or a clear exit strategy. And so this is something that likely the United States is going to be tangled up in for a long time to come. So on that somewhat depressing note, we are going to end our U.S. since 1877 coverage. Thank you so much for listening to all of this. Hopefully in another 10 years, I'll come back and I'll start to revisit the Obama years. I tried last year to do that in class and just couldn't get to it. It's just too soon. Unfortunately for us, the war on terrorism continues. So all of what I said today about trends and other things could be proven to be completely incorrect within another 10 years' time of hindsight. But for now, we'll put a pin on it. Thanks for listening. I'm Dr. Esmacher.